My name's Kat Rosqueta, and I'm the executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. For those of you who aren't familiar with the center, it was founded about 6 years ago by the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. And our center's mission is to translate knowledge, research, data, the practitioner wisdom that's in the room, and make it more useful for donors and advisors who care about impact. So that's my professional hat today. Steve Alderman asked me, so are you the person playing Oprah? And I'll ask you to use your imagination, and if Oprah were a 5'3" Asian American woman, then yes, that's me. And the session today is called Co-Designing for Impact. There's a lot of lip service that's paid to local ownership, involving stakeholders, and what this conversation is about is what does that really mean, and how do you actually do it, and what are some of the challenges that we all face in not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. When the four of us were preparing for this session, I felt compelled on Friday to cut us off, because I thought, no, I want to keep you guys fresh for GPF. So the structure will be, I will introduce each of them, and I have a specific question for each of them to get us all going, but in the true spirit of co-design, I hope and expect a very active audience participation for this session. Immediately to my left is Mathias Craig. He started blueEnergy, which is a social impact organization that connects the poorest, most isolated communities to things they need to live: energy, clean water, other essential services, and trains leaders to work globally for a more sustainable, equitable world. Next to Mathias is Kate Gross. She is the CEO of the Tony Blair African Governance Initiative, which we got a teaser for when Prime Minister Blair spoke the other night. AGI works side by side with national governments to build their capability to implement the policies that lift their people out of poverty, enabling them to build power stations, roads, deliver health care, and improve the lives of subsistence farmers. Dominic Muren is founder and principal of the Humblefactory, a design laboratory in Seattle, Washington, which develops tools and technologies to increase the capabilities of makers around the world. And we'll find out what exactly makers are. So to kick off, I'm actually going to start with Kate, because when we were talking on the phone, Kate said, well, what you have to understand about me is I'm sort of half government bureaucrat, half nonprofit leader. And the half that she's working on now in terms of leading the African Governance Initiative is focused on enabling fledgling democracies, some of the most fragile governments, build the capacity to achieve their goals. And I know I've spoken to a lot of donors that are stay away from those kinds of situations because of the fragility of the governments and a fear that their funds will be wasted or potentially even misused because of the lack of the capability of the government. So how exactly do you go about strengthening a government so it actually serves the needs of its people and uses its newfound power well?
Thank you very much, Kat, and thanks to all of you. I'm pretty cognizant of the fact that we've got the pre-lunchtime slot, so I'm going to talk really briefly about AGI. Sorry, is there a microphone?
Just go
close. Closer. I'm going to try and keep really brief, right? And I'm going to talk about AGI and what we do. And hopefully in the Q&A, we'll be able to talk a bit about what that might mean for all of you guys in the room. And I'm sure that a lot of you will have heard Tony on Monday. And I have to say, he is a truly inspirational guy to work for, and I've been with him for about 10 years now. And I guess he's really good at setting out the big strategy, the big vision, and I'm the backroom girl. I'm the implementer. So I'll give you a bit of the backroom story of AGI. And I want to talk a bit about Rwanda, which is where we tested out our theory of change. And the story of Rwanda is it's very big for me this week because it's the 18th anniversary since the start of the genocide, so I'm thinking about it a lot. So back in the end of 2007, I got a call from Tony about 6 months after he left office, and he said to me, right, I think I want to do something in Africa. I've got this idea about supporting leaders. I've had a call from President Kagame in Rwanda, and I want you to go and talk to him and talk to the Rwandans and see if this thing has got legs. And I thought, right, I think this thing has got legs, and off I went to Kigali. And I found myself talking to a really amazing man who was the president's senior advisor, a guy called David Himbara. And I sat in his office, and he told me his vision for the country and the president's vision. And he pointed to this bunch of reports behind him on the shelf and just said, we have all these reports which say, from outside advisors who fly in, this is how you can make the change that you want to see. Our problem is not that we don't know what we want to do. It's not that we haven't got this brilliant kind of technical advice how to do it. It's implementation and capacity. And the issue in Rwanda, which I've actually seen sort of replicated in other post-conflict countries, is that this sort of strata of professionals in government was just decimated by the genocide. So you have a really amazing president, and so a handful of people around him are very, very capable. But then as you move deeper into the ministries, there just isn't any capacity to kind of implement the sort of change that you guys want to see. And we found this, on a very personal level. The people who we work with once we put our team there, who the Rwandans have brought in to rejuvenate their public service, most of them had never switched on a computer before. And one guy we worked with had spent his entire life in a Tanzanian refugee camp, and this was his first experience of government. So what do we do about this? Well, we put in teams of very international staff. So from all over the world, we've got people from the US and Canada and the UK, but also from Australia, from India, China, Singapore, Pakistan. People who've done it, people who are like me, are kind of mid-career professionals, so who've got 10 or 15 years of experience, and who want to share some of that with these places in Africa, and who want to transfer some of these skills and build some of the systems and processes. And these people live in the countries we work in. They're there all the time. They sit shoulder to shoulder along with their counterparts, whether they're chiefs of staff or very junior analysts. And they're complemented by what Tony does, which is to work alongside the leaders as a kind of coach and a mentor. And I think this part of it is, the sort of the combination of the two is unique, because obviously there's just no manual for how you run a country. And so what Tony does is kind of help the leaders with his advice and his expertise on that kind of question. So that was about 4 years ago. We are now at the point where we've sort of had 3 years of proof of concept, not just in Rwanda, but in Sierra Leone and Liberia. But this year we decided we were going to scale up in a big way. So by the end of this year, we're going to be in 6 African countries. We'll have nearly 50 staff on the ground there. And we just got a call over the weekend from one of Africa's newest leaders saying, please, can you guys come and help? The things that I guess we do, which I think are powerful, are, as Tony said, we don't bring our own agenda. Our agenda is the country's agenda, and we're there to help them implement it. Second, there's been a lot of talk about how you build capacity. And I guess our view is that you can't build it in a vacuum. You can't expect people to go on a training course. You can't expect them to take time out of their busy jobs in government to learn. You have to focus on what they want to do, what they want to achieve, and help them do that, and to build the skills and the capability through that route. And then the very final thing is that this is obviously all about sustainability. So our aim is to do ourselves out of a job. And we're talking about being in these countries for 2, 3, 4 years max, and then when we leave, there will be a cadre of people from that country who can run the government and who can implement these priorities themselves. And that's pretty much all I want to say. We can talk a bit more about what it means for you guys later, I guess.
Perfect. Thanks, Kate. I mean, what struck me about your response was how much of what you're doing is addressing isolation, lack of exposure to tools because you were in a refugee camp, or lack of exposure to a peer group, bringing an international peer group of folks who have had the same roles that you're trying to prepare these folks to do. Matthias, you work in communities that are quite geographically isolated, and you shared that for many people, for many donors, those aren't the communities they want to work in, because that isolation and lack of infrastructure often means that donors don't get the bang for buck they seek. So can you talk about why you work there, and also how do you get good bang for buck? Examples of how you can make the change in what some people view as not worth it yet.
Thank you, and thanks for having us here today. Yes, blueEnergy is an organization that works to bring energy, water, and sanitation services to some of the poorest, most isolated communities in the Western Hemisphere. we started and continue to have a geographic focus in the country of Nicaragua, working on the Caribbean coast. And I think while we are geographically focused in that area, I think it's a representative geography. It's an area that has a very complicated political structure, not a lot of capacity of government. Nicaragua at a national level suffers from that, but also there's certain territorial realities in Nicaragua I won't go into now, but there's a regional government, there's also an indigenous and territorial government on the coast. And because of that, there's a lack of a lot of basic services. So we're working in communities that don't have roads, that most of them don't have access to cell phones, don't have access to microfinance, don't have access to energy, don't have access to clean water. So when most organizations choose not to work in those kinds of areas for exactly what you said. It's hard to get big bang for your buck. It's hard to talk about short-term scaling and a lot of things in communities like that. And I think, yes, we're on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, but it is representative of a certain segment of the world population that doesn't benefit from a lot of these inputs that other organizations can come and leverage to do a lot of the great things we've heard about in the last 2.5 days. And I think something that I really want to focus in on and maybe have a conversation with you guys about today is about what are we doing about the most marginalized people as we invent these other great tools like microfinance and impact investing. Where does that leave a huge segment of the world population that isn't ready to receive that kind of capital and doesn't have all the peripheral services, sort of the service ecosystem around them to be able to make something of that. So I think that's one of the things that's fairly unique about blueEnergy is we work where the government doesn't go, where companies definitely don't have an interest, and where most nonprofits don't want to go because it's very complicated to address. And I think part of how we make success there is we're extremely patient. We work very hard and we work over time. We've been there for 8 years. We've worked in 18 communities, and a lot of our approach is around. The title of this is Co-Designing for Impact. For us, that means a lot in practice. We work very closely with the communities that we serve. We work with the indigenous territorial government. We work with the regional government. We work with the national government. And that takes a lot of energy and time, and it takes resources. And I think one of the things that everybody agrees is that there should be more collaboration, more co-design, more co-implementation. We've heard a lot of that the last couple of days. My experience in the field is that it's highly underfunded or just not funded. Very often we want to see collaboration, but we want to see it for free magically somehow. And what I've learned, because I have an engineering background, so I studied engineering and then we started blueEnergy. So we were originally very focused on technology with some social services around it, training, capacity building, maybe 80% technology, 20% the other stuff, and now it's the other way around. We're 80% working with people, talking with people, building capacity. And what I've learned along the way is that takes fundamentally a different skill set in the organization. Coordinating, hosting meetings, sharing knowledge, analyzing data, learning from it is a different skill set than just implementing these services. And I think we need to be realistic about what it takes to get the implementing organizations to have those skills and to really have that focus within their institution, and that work needs to be funded. So I'll leave that there for now.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're sort of, often people, when they think capacity building, they think capacity for implementation. I think you're highlighting a very specific capacity that's often overlooked, which is capacity to actually collaborate to get more impact. So Dominic, your work illustrates the fact that you don't need to be geographically isolated to have this problem of not having the kinds of connections and the links to truly co-design solutions that work. So my question for you is, who are makers and why and how are you enabling them?
Well, that's a great question. So let me explain makers by explaining a little of what's happening in the manufacturing world in the last maybe 10 years. We're seeing the emergence of new technologies, new computer-controlled fabrication technologies, like you may have heard of 3D printing, CNC machining, these various different tools that allow relatively less skilled people to make relatively much more sort of high-performance things, and to do that from design specifications that can be shared virtually. So you have at once two really important things happening. First of all, you don't need to have highly skilled trained technicians or craftspeople to make complicated objects, and you can design something anywhere on Earth and then make it anywhere on Earth, right? And it can be shared via this sort of global cloud of ideas. Now, that's a very idealized version of this thing, but what makers are people that are taking advantage of these advances. And it doesn't necessarily just happen in the developed West, it's happening all over the world. In fact, if you've seen Amy Sun talk, she may be in here somewhere hiding. Amy runs FabFolk, and she is also heavily involved with the Fab Labs, which are these sort of collections of makers in buildings all over the world. She runs three labs that she's building in Afghanistan now. There are labs in all across Africa, across South America, all across the US and Europe, and many of them popping up around the Pacific Rim and in Central Asia and India. So these collections of these makers really are sort of decentralized factories, or decentralized manufacturing infrastructure, right? What's different, though, about them is they aren't formalized. A lot of times these are people who are just doing this because industry wouldn't make something for them, or it couldn't make something for them. And so that something that they're making varies from country to country. In the US, in the more affluent cities, you tend to see things that are toys, tchotchkes, fun, covers for your iPhones. But in cities like Detroit, you tend to see things that really are important. If you have people making, actually just recently there was a Kickstarter project, which Kickstarter is this crowdfunding thing, we'll probably talk about it in a second. This Kickstarter project for a fully self-contained, self-watering little greenhouse for your backyard that these guys, neither one of them is a computer scientist or an agronomist, greenhouse designer, but they thought it would be cool if you could grow tomatoes without having to, go out and water this thing if you're going on vacation. And so they pulled an open source electronic hardware sort of microcomputer that can monitor the water levels and administer water when it needs to. And they put together a design for a small greenhouse that could fit on a back patio of a house or in a apartment's, balcony. And now they have this sort of robotic greenhouse for growing tomatoes that is self-sufficient anywhere. This same kind of collective design can work in a variety of settings. So it doesn't have to be the developed West, it doesn't have to be the developing world. In fact, Amy has seen some projects that were developed in Afghanistan, particularly a decentralized Wi-Fi network, implemented in Colombia. So you have sort of like the most developing world country on Earth actually contributing technology to a fairly developed country, right? Like you have this total reversal of the flow of technology. So what's exciting to me about makers and what we do to enable them is to participate in this sort of this global conversation about what can we make, how do we make it, and really sharing and developing these open hardware solutions and pushing them out there.
What was interesting when we were talking earlier, you described how too often in the design world, and I mean sort of product design world, the attitude of the designers is, we know what you need, we'll just make it for you. Right. And the nods here I could sense over the phone. You could have replaced design world, funding world, government world. Right. And so it sounds like because of technology, you are able to hear the needs of what folks might have. Is that the way to...
Right, yeah. I was having a conversation with Steve Hilton, and he brought up in the book about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is kind of famous for saying that, like, no, we're definitely not going to, ask people what they want, because they don't know what they want, right? And that is very much this mentality of designers. We have this kind of arrogance about we know what you need. What's exciting about this reimagining of manufacturing is it becomes much more of a pull situation. So we all push our ideas out into the world, and then people can pull from those ideas based on what they know about their context. So it's not necessarily a co-designing process because you're literally right there next to the person and you're talking with them, but it is very much co-designing because you're contributing to and pulling from the same collective resource.
Kate and Matthias, I think it was Luis earlier this morning talked about, and I've had, I feel like a little bit of the Groundhog Day thing. I've had this conversation with several other donors here as well. How hard it can be to listen. So I would love examples of how you and your colleagues make sure you're listening, and why, what is the obstacle to hearing the needs that you can then use to actually design solutions that work. Should I? Sure, either one of you.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say the same thing as Luis. He was very profound this morning on active listening. And I think the thing that I'm really grateful for is that we at AGI have managed to hire some amazing people who are all very, very good at active listening. Because co-design is not just what you do with the government when you go in and say, right, what do you really, really want? It's what you have to do every single day with every single one of the people you work with. You have to understand, them, their individual incentives, what's driving them, what they need, and then also what the government needs, what the system needs, what the country needs. And I guess that is a very, as Mathias is saying, is not a skill set which is, it kind of comes naturally to a lot of folk, and development folk in particular. It's quite a different kind of way of looking at things. So what stops you from doing that stuff? Well, listen, I think this isn't all on us in this room when it comes to governments in particular. I think we have to remember that there are some big onuses on the governments themselves, right? They have to do three things. They have to be honest, they have to be open, and they have to be accountable. In terms of honesty, no one is going to channel money through government if that's just going to be embezzled. Of course not. In terms of openness, they have to be confident enough to let you guys in and let us in. And for a sovereign government, that's really hard. But the most kind of forward-looking governments that we work with just say, right, we'll import the skills from wherever they come. That's absolutely fine. And then we'll learn from you, and then we'll wave you goodbye. Cool. And then the final thing is accountability. And this is a really big issue, right? The governments have to be accountable to the people so that they're co-designing with them. And I think this is really difficult for any government around the world. It's something that in the UK, Tony struggled with a lot in the government there. I think the interesting thing about the places we work in Africa is that accountability doesn't have to follow exactly the old Western rules. I've seen some really interesting examples of how it's happening in a place like Rwanda, where they bring together annually government, local government, civil society, media, a whole host of people, and they do co-design, right? It just doesn't look like the way that governments in the West do it. And I just think that's an interesting point to remember.
Can you talk a little bit more about what we might not in the West, what I might not from the West see as co-design, but that clearly is?
I think you'd see it as co-design. I mean, another thing the Rwandans are doing, which is great, is they have this thing called Imihigo, which is a local performance contract between the mayor of the district and all of the people in the district. And Rwanda's pretty small, so you can do that on a really local level. And that's the way that the people hold the mayor accountable, and then the mayor holds the national government accountable. And I just think that's awesome.
I mean, to me, that's just another example of innovation from out.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the mayor of Philadelphia having a performance contract? Thank you for that example. Matthias?
Yeah, so on the listening subject, that's a really important one that Luis touched on earlier today. We face it internal to the organization and externally, and I think they're related, but we work in Spanish, French, and English every day just because of the nature of our organization and how we got started. That in of itself poses huge communication challenges. Again, you have people coming in maybe to be a practitioner, they're not a communications expert. but it requires, a certain level of investment in learning how to work and understand each other within the organization. Secondly, we're choosing to work in a very multi-ethnic area. So we're working with primarily indigenous and several different Afro-descendant groups. And so communication, even just basic communication on a daily basis is really challenging. So I think we've learned that we need, as we're bringing people into the organization, not just filtering for sort of more traditional skills and what their credentials say, but just observing them and how they communicate with people, and their listening and understanding is has at least two parts. One is a desire to do it. Right? Are you even aware that that's important, that you need to listen to other people and be an active listener? And the second is the skill set that requires. The first one, almost impossible to teach. Some people have it, some don't. The second part, you can build skill over time. And the second point I wanted to make is that this idea of the design, like designers bringing the answer to people. I mean, I think in rare exceptions that can work. I think you had Ford who said also, I don't ask people what they want because they'd say a faster horse. Right? And they wouldn't necessarily imagine what the next technology gadget is going to be if it's just a leap from where people currently are. But a lot of what we're doing in development is not that. It's not some radical shift. It's really incremental progress, improving services. And that's where I think people's input into the design process is absolutely critical. And one thing we've focused on the last couple of years with the work of a good colleague who's actually just finishing up his PhD at Berkeley, but's been working with us for 7 years, is how does that actually look when you're out in the community, multi-ethnic community, you're choosing to work in a very isolated place, often characterized by lack of a lot of information. Right? So they understand very well how their community works, but they don't necessarily understand the national forces driving policy. They don't understand international market forces that are chopping down their forests and they're taking their fish, and a lot of lack of information there. So we've actually been developing through this colleague, Christian Casillas, been developing a role-playing game where you actually introduce information that's outside of their context, then have a conversation about how that might change their decision-making. And it's a very intensive process, but you're trying to come to a common understanding that's not what we know from the outside world, because we don't understand their community very well. And it's not just what they know. They understand the community very well, but not the outside world very well. Trying to build sort of a middle road that's better, right?
Yeah. So I mean, just this recurring theme of the linkages to what they don't currently have. Well, especially given the language issues, what I picked up from you is, okay, you need the will and the skill, but over time. So I mean, I'm sure for all of you is. The tension between a mandate to implement and produce versus the time and reflection required to listen and understand. How much, I mean, I'm observing this now, but how big a tension is that, and are there ways that you have learned to cope?
If I can just take that one quickly. It's a huge tension for us, because especially when you're working with communities that don't necessarily communicate the way you do. It's one thing if we were to, walk out here and talk to people. There's certain norms that are common between people, but when you get really out there and those norms sort of disappear, it's much more of an exploratory process. You really have to be committed over time. And it's not a question of going and doing a survey and just asking them what they want. I think that's a common mistake. In the old days, we just told them exactly what they needed. Then we said, well, we'll just ask them what they want and then do that. But who are you asking? Who was there that one day when you went in? Did they even understand the questions? Are they used to direct questions? Do they know what a survey is? And oftentimes the answer is no. So you have to go and just sit there and listen. And maybe they'll tell you one thing, but you spend a couple days, over months, years, and observe different types of behavior. It's not all communicated orally. So you have to be open to that. And in blueEnergy, we started with mostly technical teams within the organization, but then our community engagement team is now bigger than our technical team. Because that means a lot of sort of boots on the ground and spending a lot of times out in the community. And I think the challenge for us as an institution right now is it's hard to package that, measure the results of that, and communicate that effectively to get funded. But I think that probably is the most important piece of the work we do. And then at the end, we provide energy or water or whatever. But that it's very hard to measure the results of that in the short term. That's one of our big challenges.
I think it's actually it's similar with in working with this very disaggregated, very decentralized. It's not like I can just call up every maker on Earth. There's probably between 50 and 300,000 of them, I'm gonna guess, right? Like there's this totally nebulous, and it's changing all the time, right? Because new people are graduating from school, new people are learning new skills, new people are coming up with new capabilities. So what's complicated is you push work out, and sometimes that's new techniques for using an existing tool to make a bicycle, for example, or a part of a mechanical assembly, or it might be new ways of designing electronics so they're more modular. You push that stuff out, and it may not get used. It may not get used for a long time. It's not going to get used until, and I think, Matthias, your point about Henry Ford and if they would have asked me or if I would have asked them what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. But if you put out the idea of a Model T, right, and you just have it out in front of your factory, and you show people using the Model T and on the farm moving stuff around, pretty soon you're going to start having people say, hey, you know what? If I could build a Model T, or if I could implement a tiny Model T factory in my community, and maybe I'd make these little modifications, then the Model T becomes, they can adopt it, right? But it does take time. And I think we share that difficulty in getting support from sort of traditional financial and resource institutions, because you're not going to have a million things implemented tomorrow, right? But over the next year, maybe we'll have 100 million things implemented in exactly the right places versus a million things that might sort of go in this average place that doesn't really serve all those niche needs.
I'm quite cognizant of the fact that for a panel entitled Co-Design, I need to open this up quickly to Q&A. So I'll just ask, when you have a question, if you could just please stand up, and because we're recording it, somebody will come to you with a microphone, and please say your name as you ask your question. Right here.
Hi, I'm Ana Maria from Colombia, and I have a question for Kate, and has to do with how do you deal with the fact that governmental officials and those people who make decisions at the local government are constantly changing, because that's something we have to deal in. We participate, or we fund together with a group of NGOs in Colombia, a project that aims at improving the skills of those who are in power, in local power, governors, mayors. And as soon as you succeed and you have this great partner and you're very happy and you want to go out and celebrate, they're out of power. And then elections come in and you have to start all over again. And for us, it makes us feel as we are losing our time sometimes. So I just want to learn if you're thinking about that.
Do you want to take a few, or shall I go?
Why don't you go with that, and then I'll
cool.
take a look at where the hands are.
So Anna Maria, I can understand that in a big way. And listen, we see the individuals we work with in Africa, we see them getting poached by the development institutions, by the private sector, who can pay way more. And that's frustrating, because that means there is a lot of change, but it's also really good for these people, right? It's good that they're going into those roles. And you've just got to trust that there is a public service ethos, and these people will recycle back into the public service. What we do is we try and build systems, not just people, because I think where you can sort of change different bits of a system rather than just building individuals within it, then you've got a greater chance of that sticking. And we can talk about that more. I guess the other thing I'd say, and this was one of the things I wanted to say to the whole room, is you've just got to accept that that's politics, right? Democracy means changes of government, and it means risk. And it means you just have to accept that some of these governments, particularly in the places we work, where they're really sort of fragile, it might not survive, it might not work. But I think that the very best sort of philanthropy takes that kind of a risk. And when it sees, a country which is sort of taking off, it's got all the kind of the things in place, and where finally maybe there's a good leader after 50 years of a single party rule, then you just kind of go in behind it and you say, this is the moment, let's give it a shot, And then let's hope that some of those people will stick and some of those systems will stick, and it will help to create a better future.
Kate, I loved what you said. I really did. I'm from the Peter C. Alderman Foundation, and like you, we work in several East African post-conflict countries. And like you, we fill the implementation gap between what the policy makers are doing and getting it to their populations. You are now ready to scale up, and this is my question. How will you ensure, you're going to have lots of folks on the ground, how will you ensure that your implementation and dissemination will not drift too far from your core principles? I'm sure you've given this thought, and boy, we could learn from you. We manualize, but that's different. I mean, we're doing evidence-based stuff. You're not. So what's your thinking?
Should I go again, Kat?
Yeah.
It's a massive question for us. And I guess there's two things. I mean, first of all, we've been very busy working in places that are in a real hurry to change. So we haven't had a massive amount of time as an organisation, or frankly the funding, to do our lessons learned work, to really kind of pull together what we're learning and then to share it out into all these new places we're going. So that's one thing. We need to invest in that. We've got to fundraise for it and we've got to do it, even though it can seem less important than helping a government, deliver healthcare or whatever else. Second thing is, and this is the big change since we started this 4 years ago, and something I've really come to see, one of the best things we can do is connect up the governments we're working with each other, because they're all innovating, and the more that we can find ways to help them share that, but in a way that doesn't kind of burden them and take up their time from kind of the business of government, the better. So connecting up, chiefs of staff, these junior analysts, connecting up presidents so that they can learn the lessons of success, I think is a really important thing for us in the future.
And one observation, in some ways, I could imagine people characterizing all of the work you do as a scale play. I mean, when you're talking about capacity building at the government level, the result of that should be change at scale that will enable those folks who are more in the service provision to be able to do their jobs more effectively.
Exactly.
So governance is a scale strategy.
Yeah.
Yep.
We catalyze you lot.
I hope. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I also work in Colombia, and I had a question for Mathias. We're currently advising the Colombian government in their public policy of water and sanitation in the rural areas. And I had a question for you regarding your 8 years of experience in Nicaragua. What, in your opinion, are the key elements of your model of blue energy that provide water and sanitation access in a sustainable way?
Good question. One, I think, is a commitment if you're going to be changing culture and behavior around water and sanitation. I think there has to be a time commitment. I think that has to be number one. It's not something you change right away. Two is that water and sanitation have to go together. It's really ineffective to tackle one without the other. If you think about the water cycle in terms of consumption, human consumption of water, you have sort of pre-contamination, you have access to the water, you have purification of the water, and then you have things like hand washing, which are critical. And if you address, many times you see around the world, if you just address one of them, if you just install a water filter, for example, standalone, but the latrine, the open pit latrine is right next to the well, and people don't have soap and they aren't washing their hands, you're just not going to generate a big health benefit, even if you're purifying the water. So I think when you look at tackling a water program, it's really a WASH program, water and sanitation together. I think that's a key component of it. Third thing I think is general for a lot of different technologies or service solutions is you have to figure out ways to get buy-in from the people, obviously. Not just having a giveaway culture, but how do you get people committed to the solutions? And that's one where I think when you're working with the communities to figure out if that's a priority for them, just asking them, do you want clean water? The answer is usually yes, we would love that. But question two is what are they willing to put in to get that? To measure sort of their actual perceived value of that service. At blueEnergy, we have a policy that we don't give things away, even though we're working with the poorest of the poor. We often set a very, very low price, but they're contributing to the capital cost of the system. It might just be a couple dollars, but again, it's a step in demonstrating a desire to really invest in that solution. And then often an in-kind contribution, which could be hosting our work teams or feeding the work teams and providing labor themselves as part of the buy-in process. But I think those are three important ones.
Other questions? One thing I want to pick up on, because you started down this route, it's not just a matter of co-designing, but co-investment. Right? The solution is better because multiple people are actually invested in some way, monetarily in some cases, sweat equity in other cases. Dominic, how does it work with the makers? And who's investing what there for those solutions?
It's really interesting because a lot of people ask, like, okay, you have this open source hardware, how does anybody make any money? Because you just publish your designs, you got no IP. And what we find is that there are two factors going on. The first one is that it actually is pretty possible to make money by leveraging your knowledge of a community rather than by leveraging your control of the IP that you have. So when you leverage your knowledge of the community, you might use maybe there's a pool of 15 variations on a design, and you need to, for your context, choose the best variation. Let's say it's an MP3 player, okay? And you're in the rave scene in San Francisco. I don't know if y'all are ravers, but I would imagine that this 13-year-old kid that wants to go just dance their face off for 15 hours is going to use a very different type of music playing device than somebody who's listening to jazz in New York City, right? And so if you can sort of remix an appropriate device from these totally available things, but you really have to be in that. I'm not in that world. I don't know that. I couldn't design it, right? I'm not the guy to design that, but some 13-year-old in San Francisco is. And they're going to be able to control that sort of marketing by locking down that perfect design for those guys. As far as contribution goes, that's where you have really intentional community design. So one of the projects that we're working on at Humblefactory is called alchematter.org, which is a platform for sharing these open hardware designs. And like Facebook or like any of these social networking sites, you actually build social currency by contributing and by commenting and by iterating and by having derivatives made of your work. So it's an online way of tracking that value so that you get people to participate. But that sort of tracking happens in offline places too. It happens in hacker spaces. You get this social credit and you get this kind of culture building. So I think it's a lot to do with what Mathias is saying about the demonstrate or get the community invested. You know, when you bring these makers together, they have that social contract, right? Between us, it's me and you. I helped you on this project, you helped me on this project, now we're connected, right? And I think the more you can reinforce that, the better everything gets.
Well, and it emphasizes social capital as a valuable currency between and among the people you're talking about. Kate, I hear a lot of from you. Is there in your world? What's the analogy? Or
I mean, I think co-design is partnership, right? And so both sides have to bring something to the table, and this is something that we take really seriously with our governments. They invite us in, and that's cool, but they have to bring something too. It's not just a free good. And in some places that means that they part fund it, either with their own money or money that they raise from the international finance institutions. But in other places, it's a question of them putting skin in the game, right? So that they really feel that they want to change and they are going to do something about it. And in a lot of cases, that just means hiring people. It means committing to bringing in a new cadre of young professionals who we can work with, who are going to be the next generation of talent in the government. And I was talking to Yvonne over there about the work in Liberia and this fantastic program called the President's Young Professionals Program, which brings in these fantastic young Liberians who we work with, who are going to be, the next generation of leaders in that country. And that's what we ask of government, that they commit to doing things like that.
Any last questions before I take moderator's prerogative and ask my last one? Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about risk and learning, and so I'll start going down because I didn't prep you for this, but can you describe a mistake and what you learned from it so that the folks in the room don't have to make that same mistake again? Dominic?
Yeah, I can. So the reason that I am here, where doing open hardware stuff, doing that sort of thing, right out of undergrad, I worked as a toy designer for 2 years, and while that was really lots of fun, one of the things you may or may not know about toy design is it is the most locked down, just closed off, secretive industry on Earth. I had one colleague that had the loose lips sink ships World War II poster in his cubicle, and he totally stood by it. And I think that for me was, I was well onto adopting that mentality, and then I realized that I was getting stodgy. I was actually I was becoming a stodgy old 23-year-old, and it was because I was closing down, right? It was because I wasn't being open to good ideas that other people had, because I was trying to hoard all my ideas for myself. And I think that the lesson I learned is that, and this is really the key underpinning of open hardware, is that value comes from your engagement with the community and your understanding of other people. It doesn't come from having the best idea. Ideas are cheap. There's lots of people have ideas. In fact, you can have infinite ideas, but getting them implemented and getting them right is what really is valuable. So that's, I think.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
Sort of too many mistakes to count, really. And for me, I was pretty young when I started this. I was 29 when I started the African Governance Initiative. So I don't think I knew a whole lot about leadership, and I didn't know anything about the non-profit sector. And so the whole kind of creation of this organisation has been just a huge journey for me. And let's be fair, Tony knew a lot about government and politics. He didn't know a whole lot about non-profit or philanthropy either. So it's been a great learning for both of us. I think my point is, I've learned so much from listening to you two, but my point is actually quite similar to yours. One of the lady who runs our sister foundation, Ruth Turner, the Faith Foundation, she said yesterday that as a social entrepreneur, she learned that you needed to make the tools available from the very beginning, because that's how you really get to kind of scale. And frankly, I just don't think we thought about that 4 years ago. I think we were so focused on working in these countries where we could see that the window of opportunity for change was just going to close. We wanted to get in there. That we didn't think enough about how we were going to connect people up together, focus on our learning, the kind of internal organisational stuff rather than the outward stuff. And I'm a government geek, not a technology geek. And if I could find ways to bring people together in my organisation to have these kind of conversations across these places with no connectivity, that's the thing I'd love to do most now.
Mathias?
Very good. Well, yeah, a lot of mistakes along the way, but a lot of them, I think, contextual and situational, so I'll skip those because I don't think that'd probably make them again if we went back in time. But I think three things that I would change just briefly. One is the tech-social balance. I mean, it's taken us 8 years to understand that, and again, I come from an engineering background, so I came with this bias that technology was, not going to be 100% of the solution, but I thought it was going to be the majority of the solution. And I've really come to appreciate that it can't be more than 10, maybe 20% of the solution. And so if I could take that back in time with me, I think that would be very useful. Second point is kind of reflecting your comment about focusing on some internal development stuff before. It's like maybe do a little bit less doing.
Yeah.
in the beginning and a little more reflecting and learning, especially since I started this out of graduate school and also had no business background, didn't know much about the social sector. So we could have spent a little bit more time, I think, developing internal systems, and in particular, development, meaning fundraising capacity in the organization. We spent 8 years out there working in the field, trying to improve how we're delivering services, how we work with people, and sort of maybe just an engineering silly bias, but I thought that the good work would just lead to a lot more resources and it would just grow naturally somehow, sort of leaving out that whole sort of development sales part where you have to actually communicate what you're doing and have a newsletter and interact with donors. And so only now, 8 years into it, are we realizing that. And I think we've squeezed all the blood from the rocks that we can in 8 years and really bootstrapped. But now it's like, oh yeah, well we could really grow this, but that's going to take resources. How do you get those? And then finally, culture before systems. There's been a lot of talk about data collection and IT systems and reporting and analytics and all this great stuff. And again, from my engineering background, I highly value those things. But I also, back in 2005, near the beginning of the organization, we got a donation from Salesforce Foundation, for example, before they had the foundation, actually. We were one of the first grantees of a license. I really spent 2 years trying to push that into the organization because I valued that system. People refused to use it. The internet connection was so bad they didn't know how to use it. And now, 8 years later, we're re-implementing it, and it's going a lot smoother because at this point, people really value it. There's a culture now where people are like, yeah, I really do want to access that document or that data, so they'll contribute. Instead of me just pushing and saying, IT is great, like, we need a data system. But if that culture is not in your organization, don't even bother hiring consultants and paying for the system.
Thank you. We are standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to thank you for your attention and your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their experiences.
Thank you.